Sheriff Benjamin Carter's eyes opened at 5:10 a.m. sharp, the same way they had for 53 years, ever since drill sergeants at Fort Benning taught him sleep was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford. The darkness outside his bedroom window still held Pine Ridge, Montana in its grip, but his body knew dawn approached the way old wounds knew rain. He swung his legs off the bed joints, protesting with the arithmetic of age, and reached for the bottle of ibuprofen on his nightstand. 4 pills instead of the recommended 2. The arthritis in his knees didn't respect labels. The sheriff's department sat quiet when he arrived his cruiser, the only vehicle in the lot. 38 years he'd walked through these doors, first as a deputy, fresh from Vietnam, with a head full of ghosts, now as the retiring sheriff with 6 months left on his badge. The coffee maker sputtered to life under his practiced hands, and he settled into the chair that had molded itself to his frame over nearly 4 decades. The office smelled like old case files and burned coffee, institutional paint, and the weight of secrets kept. His wall told the story he couldn't speak aloud. Margaret's photograph, taken 3 weeks before cancer hollowed her out, still smiled at him from its frame. His commendations hung beside it, each one a reminder of crimes solved, lives saved, promises kept. The class photo from his Army medic unit in 1971 showed 23 young men barely old enough to vote, already old enough to die. 11 of them never made it home. Ben's finger traced the faces sometimes when insomnia won, and dawn seemed impossibly far. But the photograph that pulled his attention every morning showed 2 men in their 20s, arms slung across each other's shoulders, grins wide and reckless. David Thompson in his firefighter's turnout gear, Ben in his deputy's uniform. Both of them young enough to believe they'd conquered death by surviving their respective wars. The date stamped on the back read June 1982. Brothers in arms, different wars, the inscription said in David's handwriting. Ben's hand trembled slightly as he opened his bottom desk drawer, the one that locked the one nobody else had keys to. The stack of letters inside had yellowed at the edges, David's careful handwriting covering page after page. 20 years of correspondence from 1987 until David's death in 2014. Ben pulled one at random, unfolding the creased paper. Ben Sarah graduated high school today, top of her class, full ride to the University of Washington for nursing. I watched her walk across that stage, and I thought about all the things I've seen burn, all the destruction, and somehow this girl survived to become something beautiful. If anything ever happens to me, you remember this moment. Remember, she's got her whole life ahead. You watch over her brother. Not like a cop, like a father. Promise me. Ben folded the letter with hands that had held dying men, that had pulled triggers that had failed when it mattered most. The promise sat in his chest like shrapnel, working its way deeper with each passing year. He reached deeper into the drawer, pulling out a file folder marked with a case number that existed nowhere in the official records. Thompson House Fire, October 17, 2014. The photographs inside showed a house reduced to blackened timber and ash-yellow tape cordoning off the ruins. Fire investigators had called it electrical failure, old wiring in the basement tragedy, but not suspicious. Ben had let them write that in their reports while he compiled his own evidence in secret. The photo of Sarah Thompson's medical records, obtained through channels that would have cost him his badge if anyone found out, showed third-degree burns covering 15% of her body surface. The EMT notes described a young woman aged 22, found on the front lawn, screaming for her family, right arm and shoulder already blistering from heat exposure. Below that, his own handwritten notes from that night, penned in the hours after the fire trucks left and the bodies had been removed. 2:54 a.m. arrived on scene 4 minutes before fire department. Structure fully involved, flames visible through all windows. Subject Sarah Thompson, age 22, on front lawn and approximately 30 feet from structure, severe burns to right upper extremity, hysterical, attempting to return to burning structure. Physically restrained subject while awaiting medical response. 2:57 a.m. observed individual fleeing from rear of property, moving east toward neighboring lots. Too much smoke for visual identification. Individual appeared to be carrying object, possibly container. 3:08 a.m. after fire department arrival and subject transfer to ambulance, conducted brief perimeter search. Located gasoline can in neighboring property's refuse container, approximately 150 feet from structure. Can appeared recently discarded, no fingerprints visible on cursory examination. Secured cannon as evidence stored separately from official investigation. Ben had never turned in that gas can, never mentioned the fleeing figure in his official statement. David's voice echoed in his memory words spoken over beers at the Rusty Anchor 5 years before the fire. I testified against some real bad people in that arson case, Ben. Raymond Hutchins got 20 years because I told the truth about how he burned that warehouse. 7 people died in that fire. Sometimes I wonder if he'll come back for me when he gets out. Raymond Hutchins had been released from prison 3 weeks before David's house burned. The morning light crept through the office blinds as Ben pulled out his current surveillance file. Photographs of Sarah Mitchell Ney Thompson taken from respectful distances over the past 3 years. Her walking to work at the Rusty Anchor, her waiting at the bus stop with a small boy, Dylan, age 6, her standing in the doorway of her apartment building, looking tired and alone. Ben knew her schedule better than she did. Knew she worked double shifts on Thursdays and Fridays. Knew she took Dylan to the park every Sunday afternoon. Knew she wore long sleeves even in July heat. He knew because David had asked him to know. Because a promise made to a dying friend carried more weight than badge, more weight than law, more weight than the guilt that sat in Ben's stomach like broken glass every time he remembered that night. The file contained one more document folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn thin. David's will filed 3 months before his death, naming Ben Carter as executor and guardian if anything should happen to David's family. The final paragraph had been added in pen David's handwriting, urgent and less controlled than usual. Ben, if you're reading this, something went wrong. Raymond Hutchins or someone connected to him came for us. Don't let the official investigation close this as an accident. There are things Sarah doesn't know, things I never told her because I wanted her to live without fear. She's strong, brother, stronger than she knows. But she'll need you. Keep your promise. Ben folded the will and returned everything to the locked drawer. His shift didn't officially start for another 2 hours, but he reached for his keys anyway. There was a certain apartment building on the east side of Pine Ridge where a young woman would be waking soon, getting her son ready for school, unaware that the sheriff drove past her home every morning before dawn to make sure no shadows lingered where they shouldn't. The pre-dawn cold bit through Ben's jacket as he drove through empty streets. Pine Ridge hadn't changed much in 40 years. Still a town where everyone knew everyone's business or thought they did. 3,000 souls living in the shadow of mountains, working construction and logging and service jobs, drinking at the same bars their fathers drank, at raising kids who'd probably leave for bigger cities, but remember this place with the particular ache of home. Sarah's apartment building sat at the edge of town, a 2-story structure that had been old when Ben was young. Cracks spiderwebbed through the parking lot asphalt, paint peeled from the window frames. But the rent was cheap enough for a single mother working waitress wages, and the landlord didn't ask too many questions. Ben parked across the street, engine idling, watching the second-floor window where a light had just flickered on. Through the window, he could see her moving, just a silhouette, pulling her hair back into the ponytail she wore every shift. Sarah looked so much like David it hurt sometimes. Same stubborn jaw, same careful way of moving through the world like she expected it to collapse at any moment. She'd inherited Margaret's gentle nature too, that core of steel wrapped in kindness that made people underestimate her until it was too late. The front door opened and Sarah emerged with Dylan, the boy bundled in a jacket too large for his frame, probably a hand-me-down from someone's older kid. Dylan said something that made Sarah smile, and even from this distance, Ben could see the way her face transformed. She lived in that smile and those moments with her son when the weight lifted and she could just be. They walked toward the bus stop 3 blocks away, Sarah's hand firm on Dylan's shoulder. The 6-year-old chattered constantly, his breath fogging in the cold air, and Sarah listened with the attention of someone who knew how precious those conversations were, how quickly children grew and silence replaced the questions. Ben followed at a distance the same route he'd memorized over 3 years of morning watches. The bus arrived on time, Dylan climbing aboard for the ride to elementary school, and Sarah waving until the bus turned the corner. Then her shoulders sagged slightly, the performance of, okay, ending the moment her son couldn't see. She pulled her sleeves down over her hands despite wearing a jacket tugging the fabric until it covered her wrists, then started the walk toward the Rusty Anchor. The weight of years pressed on Ben as he watched her go. David, I'm trying, he thought. I'm keeping your daughter safe. But is that enough when she doesn't even know who I am? The Rusty Anchor never quite lost the smell of last night's beer and cigarette smoke that had seeped into the wood over decades. Sarah pushed through the door at 6:30 a.m., the breakfast shift starting in 30 minutes, and found Grace Murphy already behind the bar polishing glasses that would never quite lose their water spots. Grace looked up, her face creasing into the smile that made her the heart of Pine Ridge, despite the loss etched into every line. 62 years old and still working 6 days a week, still opening this bar that her husband had bought before he shipped out to Vietnam in 1968 and never came home from. They'd listed him MIA for years before finally declaring him dead, and Grace had poured that grief into keeping the bar alive, turning it into the closest thing Pine Ridge had to a community center. The morning light through the windows caught dust motes floating lazy patterns while Sarah moved through her opening routine. Fill the coffee maker check, the beer taps wipe down the tables that never seemed to stay clean. Her movements had the precision of ritual, each action a small assertion of control, in a life that had taught her control was an illusion. Dylan's question from this morning still echoed. "Mom, why do you always wear long sleeves?" She deflected, changed the subject, distracted him with breakfast and rushing to catch the bus. But the question sat in her chest like a stone, growing heavier with each passing year. How much longer before he noticed other mothers wore short sleeves, before he pressed harder for answers she didn't know how to give? The scar tissue under her shirt sleeve pulled tight as she reached for the high shelf, chronic pain flaring in the damaged nerves. 10 years since the fire in her arm still reminded her, daily phantom flames licking across skin that had melted and been grafted back together in layers. The doctors called it a medical miracle she'd survived, that she'd kept the arm at all. Sarah called it a curse she carried in silence, hidden under fabric and careful movements, in the pretense that she was whole. Grace's voice cut through the morning quiet. "Sheriff Carter was asking about you again yesterday." Sarah's hands stilled on the glass she'd been drying. She'd never met Ben Carter, never had reason to interact with law enforcement in the 3 years since she'd fled Seattle and its ghosts for this small town where nobody knew her story. Why would the sheriff care about a waitress who kept her head down and caused no trouble? "Says he knew your father." The glass nearly slipped from Sarah's grip. Nobody in Pine Ridge knew about David Thompson, about Captain David Thompson, who died trying to save his family from flames that consumed everything. Sarah had come here specifically because nobody knew, because she could be Sarah Mitchell. Unremarkable single mother instead of Sarah Thompson, the girl who lived while her family burned. Grace wiped down the bar with deliberate slowness, giving Sarah space to respond or not respond. That was Grace's gift, the patience of someone who'd lived long enough to know grief needed room to breathe. The silence stretched until the coffee maker beeped and Sarah found her voice. "I don't know anyone named Carter." But even as she said it, something stirred in the back of her memory, a man's voice from that night, firm and steady, cutting through her screams. "I've got you. You're safe. I've got you." Strong hands holding her back from the inferno while she thrashed and screamed her brother's name. Had that voice said Carter? Had someone told her a name while her world ended? The memory slipped away before she could grasp it, the way all memories from that night did, fragmentary and unreliable, probably contaminated by trauma and smoke inhalation and the morphine they'd given her in the hospital. She'd been unconscious by the time the ambulance arrived, the EMT report said. Everything after the moment she'd fallen from her bedroom window existed in a haze of pain and terror and the smell of burning flesh. The morning regulars started arriving around 7, construction workers grabbing coffee and breakfast sandwiches before heading to the new development on the north side. Old Bill Patterson wheeling himself to his usual table near the window where he could watch the street and remember a younger world. The retired teacher whose name Sarah could never remember, but whose coffee order she knew by heart. Pine Ridge waking up the way it always did, reliable and ordinary and safe. Daniel Brooks came in at 7:45, the same time every morning, taking his corner table without being shown. Sarah had noticed him months ago, the quiet mechanic who worked at the garage down the street and ate breakfast alone every day. Noticed the way his hands bore scars from years of engine work, knuckles permanently stained with grease no amount of scrubbing could remove. Noticed the sadness that lived in his eyes, the particular exhaustion of someone carrying weight nobody else could see. Their interaction stayed professional, brief. Coffee black, 2 eggs scrambled, toast wheat. He left a good tip and never lingered. But this morning when Sarah brought his coffee, Daniel looked up and their eyes met for a moment longer than necessary. "Your boy doing okay?" The question surprised her, soft-spoken but genuine. I see you at the bus stop sometimes, early mornings when I'm opening the garage. Sarah's defensive walls went up automatically. You watching me? No. His voice held no defensiveness, just quiet honesty. I just notice. Kids his age, they're resilient, probably more than we give them credit for. The words carried weight like he was speaking from experience. Sarah set the coffee down, carefully studying this man who'd been a fixture in her peripheral vision for months, without ever really registering as a person with his own story. You have kids. Something flickered across Daniel's face, pain so quick she almost missed it. Not anymore. They're grown. But Sarah recognized the lie even as he told it. Had told enough of her own to spot the tells, the slight pause, the way his jaw tightened, the past tense that suggested something permanent and unwanted, asanad. She nodded, accepting the deflection because she understood the need for it, and moved to take his breakfast order before the rumble of motorcycle engines cut through the morning quiet. The sound grew louder, a rolling thunder that made conversation impossible, and Sarah felt the bar's atmosphere shift. Regular customers exchanged glances, a few reaching for wallets like they were already calculating whether to pay and leave. Grace emerged from the back room, her face set in the expression that had faced down drunk loggers and belligerent drifters for 40 years. Ben Carter appeared in the doorway, off-duty but never really off-duty, his hand resting near his belt, where his service weapon lived even out of uniform. 8 Harley-Davidsons pulled up outside their chrome, catching the morning sun exhaust pipes rattling the bar's windows. The Iron Skulls had arrived, Pine Ridge's least welcome regular visitors, and Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her order pad and prepared for the shift to get complicated. Marcus Donovan's hands shook as he stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror above the bathroom sink at the Iron Skulls clubhouse. 54 years old, and he looked 70. Face weathered by too much sun and whiskey eyes bloodshot from another night when sleep never quite came. The scars across his left shoulder ached in the morning cold phantom pain from shrapnel that Army surgeons had pulled out of him in 1970, but that his body remembered anyway. The burn scars on his back, hidden under his leather vest, pulled tight every time he moved, reminders of failures he couldn't outrun. The whiskey bottle on the counter held maybe 3 fingers of amber liquid, leftovers from last night's attempt to drown what couldn't be drowned. Marcus reached for it, then stopped. Not yet. Need to be clear-headed for this. Need to face what I've been avoiding for 14 years. Vietnam lived in Marcus's bones the way the fire lived in his nightmares. Some nights he couldn't tell which was worse, the village they'd torched in '69, following orders that came from officers who'd never seen combat, or the Thompson house burning, while Marcus clawed through debris, trying to reach a 12-year-old boy whose screams cut through everything else. Both fires, both times he'd failed to save the innocent. He'd been 19 when they drafted him, a farm kid from Minnesota, who'd never been farther than Minneapolis, suddenly dropped into jungle heat and an enemy that killed from shadows. The ambush on his second month in country had taught him what fear actually meant. His unit walking patrol, then gunfire from everywhere and nowhere, men falling blood, turning the red dirt black. Marcus had survived by falling into a crater and covering himself with corpses, his own men's bodies shielding him, while he lay perfectly still and prayed in languages he didn't know he remembered from childhood church. 23 months in hell, they called it. 23 months that turned a Minnesota farm boy into something else, something harder and more damaged and fundamentally alone. He'd come home in 1970 to a country that called him baby killer, that spit at the uniform, that wanted to forget the war and everyone who'd fought it. Couldn't get work, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop the nightmares that replayed the ambush on an endless loop, drank to stop the shaking, fought to feel anything besides numb. The Pine Ridge Fire Department had saved him, or he'd thought so at the time. The recruitment program for veterans pushed by a fire chief who'd served in Korea and understood what war did to men. You ran toward danger in the jungle, the chief had said during Marcus's interview. Do it here. Save lives instead of taking them. Show the world you're more than what that war made you. 39 years as a firefighter, 1975 to 2014, and Marcus had counted every life saved in the early years. 47 people in his first 12 years, then hundreds more as he gained experience and rank, becoming one of the department's most decorated officers. Each rescue felt like redemption, like balancing the scales for whatever he'd done in Vietnam that woke him screaming. David Thompson had been a new recruit in 1982, fresh from his own tour in Vietnam, and they'd recognized each other immediately the way combat veterans did. David had the same nightmares, the same startle reflex, the same need to prove he was more than a killer. They'd become friends the way soldiers did not, through talking, but through shared silence, understanding without words what they'd each survived and lost. David had shown Marcus photos of his family. Wife Margaret, daughter Sarah, baby son Ethan. "This is why I'm here," David had said. "I took lives in the war. Now I save them. It's the only way I can live with what I did." Marcus understood, had adopted that same philosophy, that same desperate need for redemption through service. They'd worked fires together, saved lives together, shared coffee at 3 a.m., waiting for calls that would let them be heroes instead of monsters. October 17th, 2014. Marcus would carry that date like shrapnel lodged too close to his spine to remove. The dispatch call at 2:58 a.m. structure fire, possible victims, trapped full response. Marcus had been senior officer on the crew, nearly 4 decades of experience, calm under pressure. He'd led his team into burning buildings hundreds of times. This was routine, except that the address made his blood freeze. David Thompson's house. The scene when they arrived belonged in hell. Flames shooting 20 feet high, heat so intense it blistered exposed skin from 30 yards away. Ben Carter already on scene in uniform, holding back a young woman who screamed and fought to run back into the inferno. Sarah Thompson, grown from the little girl in David's photos into a woman, her right arm already burned, her voice raw from smoke, and screaming her family's names. Marcus and 2 others had gone in, crawling through zero visibility, following the floor plan David had described 100 times. Found David's body in the hallway between bedrooms, already gone, overcome by smoke before the flames reached him. Found Margaret in the master bedroom, same cause. Smoke was a mercy that way, killing before the fire did. Ethan's bedroom sat at the end of the hall, and Marcus had crawled toward it while the house groaned and cracked around him, support beams weakening ceiling, threatening to collapse. He'd found Ethan's door, forced it open, found the boy in the closet exactly where David had always said to hide if there was fire. Ethan's eyes were open, terrified, but still alive, and Marcus had reached for him, fingers closing around the boy's wrist. Then the gas line exploded. The secondary blast had thrown Marcus backward, engulfed him in flames, buried him under falling debris. His team had pulled him out, his back burning, his lungs full of smoke, his hand still reaching toward where Ethan had been. By the time they'd extracted the boy's body, Ethan had been dead for minutes. Smoke inhalation, and Marcus had failed. Had been inches away from saving David's son and failed. He'd quit the fire department the next day, still bandaged from his burns, still coughing up smoke residue. Couldn't walk into another burning building, couldn't face another rescue. The guilt had swallowed him the way the jungle had, complete and suffocating. He drifted for years, taking logging jobs in Oregon, driving trucks through western states, drinking in dive bars where nobody knew his name or his story. Until 2002, when he'd met a group of veterans in a Montana bar, all of them damaged and angry and looking for something to belong to. The Iron Skulls had started as a brotherhood, men who understood nightmares and couldn't fit into normal society, who needed the rumble of engines and the road and each other to feel anything besides broken. But brotherhood had curdled into something uglier. Bar fights, intimidation, the kind of violence that felt like control when everything else spun out. Marcus had become exactly what he'd fought against in Vietnam, the bully with power, the man who hurt others because his own hurt wouldn't stop. He'd worn the president patch and led other broken men into becoming monsters too. And all the while he'd carried a photograph in his wallet. Ethan Thompson, age 12, smiling gap-toothed at the camera, holding a toy fire truck. David had given Marcus that photo a week before the fire during a chance meeting at a gas station. "Ethan wants to meet firefighters," David had said. "Thinks you guys are heroes. Keep this, show him next time you were in Seattle." There wouldn't be a next time. Ethan was ashes, and Marcus carried his picture like penance, like proof he'd failed someone who'd believed in heroes. Now Marcus pulled on his leather vest, the president patch he'd worn for 22 years, weighing heavy on his chest. The whiskey called to him, but he left it, needing clarity for what came next. Tommy Chen waited outside, leaning against his motorcycle, silent as always. Ghost, they called him, because he barely spoke, barely existed except as a shadow at the edge of every gathering. Tommy had his own guilt. He'd been the paramedic who'd treated Sarah's burns that night, who'd pronounced Ethan dead at the scene, who'd seen what fire did to a family and carried it into his own nightmares. He'd quit emergency services 6 months after the Thompson fire couldn't handle the pressure, the responsibility. Joined the Iron Skulls because broken men recognized each other. "We doing this," Tommy's voice barely carried over the morning wind. Marcus nodded, starting as Harley, feeling the engine vibrate through his damaged bones. "Been watching her for months. Time to stop being a coward." "What are you gonna say?" Marcus had no answer. How did you apologize for failing someone's entire family? How did you confess you'd carried their dead brother's photo for 14 years? How did you face the living reminder of everyone you'd let burn? The ride to Pine Ridge took 20 minutes, Marcus leading his crew through mountain roads that twisted and climbed, fall colors bleeding through the trees. Beautiful country wasted on ugly men doing ugly things. The Iron Skulls had become what Marcus hated, and he hated himself for leading them there. Today felt like ending like the moment before a firefight when you knew someone wasn't walking away. The rusty anchor came into view, its weathered signs swinging slightly in the breeze, and Marcus's hands tightened on the handlebars. Sarah Thompson worked inside. He'd confirmed it weeks ago, watching from a distance, seeing her serve drinks in clear tables and smile at customers while hiding under long sleeves even in summer heat. She wore her scars the way he wore his, covered and concealed, and pretended they didn't define everything. They parked in a line, 8 motorcycles rumbling to silence, and Marcus removed his helmet with hands that wouldn't stay steady. 54 years old, decorated veteran, experienced firefighter, president of a motorcycle gang, and he was terrified of a woman half his size who didn't even know his name. Inside the bar, the air thick with coffee and breakfast grease, Marcus saw her immediately. Sarah Mitchell, the name she used now, David Thompson's daughter, the girl who'd survived while her family didn't. She was wiping down a table, her back to the door, and when she turned, Marcus saw David's face in hers. Same stubborn jaw, same careful eyes, same way of holding herself like she expected the world to hurt her. And there, as she reached for a high shelf, her sleeve pulled up slightly, Marcus glimpsed the edge of scar tissue, shiny and discolored, the mark of fire on skin that had burned and somehow survived. Old Bill Patterson had watched enough life pass by his window table to recognize the weight of history arriving on motorcycles. 78 years old, both legs lost to a Japanese landmine on Iwo Jima in 1945, and he'd learned to read men the way others read newspapers. These bikers carried violence, but more than that, they carried purpose. The leader, the big one with the weathered face, kept his eyes locked on Sarah, like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking for years. Bill had survived war by trusting his instincts, and his instincts said this morning would change everything. Sarah moved through her tables with practiced efficiency, taking orders from the Iron Skulls, while maintaining professional distance. 8 whiskeys top shelf delivered without comment. She'd learned long ago that engaging with aggressive customers only made things worse. Smile, serve, collect payment, move on. Don't make eye contact longer than necessary. Don't give them anything to grab onto. But the leader kept staring, and Sarah felt his attention like heat on her skin. Something in his face seemed familiar. Or maybe that was paranoia speaking. Maybe all dangerous men look the same after a while, interchangeable threats wearing leather and tattoos. Old Bill watched Sheriff Ben Carter, watching the scene from the bar, hand resting near his service weapon, despite being off duty. Watched Daniel Brooks tense in his corner, ready to move if things went wrong. Watched Grace Murphy gripping a baseball bat under the counter, the same bat she'd used to crack a drunk logger's ribs back in '83 when he'd grabbed a waitress. The bar held its breath while the bikers drank, their voices getting louder, their laughter more aggressive. Sarah delivered round 2, round 3, her smile wearing thin exhaustion creeping into her shoulders. Old Bill recognized that exhaustion. He'd worn it himself for decades after the war, the tiredness of someone who'd survived something they shouldn't have and couldn't figure out how to live with it. The leader drained his 4th whiskey and slammed the glass down hard enough to crack. "Hey, sweetheart." His voice cut through the bar noise, rough as gravel, demanding attention. "Come here." Sarah approached with her order pad, her face carefully neutral. "Yes, sir. Sit with us." "I'm working, sir." I said sit. The room went quiet, all pretense of normal morning routine dissolving. Sarah's jaw tightened, her free hand pulling down her sleeve where it had ridden up slightly. "I can't do that, sir. If you'd like another drink." The leader stood 6'2" and broad as a door, towering over Sarah. who maybe reached 5'5". "What you hiding under those sleeves?" Sarah took a step back, her face paling. "That's none of your business. Everything in this bar is my business when I'm spending money here." His voice rose, drawing every eye. "You think you're better than us? Too good to show a little skin." Sheriff Carter stood, his voice carrying authority that 38 years of law enforcement had honed to a weapon. "That's enough. Pay your tab and leave." The leader turned, assessing Ben with the calm of someone who'd faced down worse than small-town sheriffs. "Or what, old man? You gonna arrest all 8 of us if I have to?" Old Bill wheeled his chair closer, positioning himself where he could intervene if violence erupted. He'd broken up enough bar fights in his decades at this table to know the signs the moment before restraint snapped and men became animals. This was close, balanced on an edge, and the leader's eyes held something beyond simple aggression. Something desperate and guilty and angry, all mixed together in a cocktail that meant someone was about to get hurt. The leader turned back to Sarah, who'd backed against the wall with nowhere else to go. "You ever been in a fire, sweetheart?" The question landed like a punch, and Sarah's face went white. Ben Carter moved forward, but the leader held up a hand. "I'm not threatening her, I'm asking a real question." His voice dropped, losing some of its aggressive edge, gaining something else. "Grief, maybe? Regret? Because I've been in fires. I know what they do to people. I know what the scars look like." Sarah's breathing had gone shallow, panic threading through her exhaustion. "You don't know anything about me." "Don't I?" The leader reached into his vest and Ben's hand went to his gun, but the leader pulled out a photograph instead. Old, worn at the edges, showing a young boy holding a toy fire truck. "Recognize this kid?" Sarah's eyes fixed on the photo, confusion mixing with the fear. "No." His name was Ethan Thompson. He was 12 years old when he died in a house fire. October 17, 2014. The leader's voice cracked slightly, emotion breaking through. "I tried to save him. I reached him. I had my hand on his wrist. And then the building exploded and I failed." The photograph slipped from Sarah's fingers, floating to the floor, and her voice came out barely above a whisper. "That's my brother. I know." The leader took a step closer, and his hand shot out before anyone could react, grabbing Sarah's sleeve. She screamed, trying to pull away, but the fabric tore, the sound of ripping cloth cutting through the bar like a gunshot. Time stopped. The torn sleeve hung loose, exposing Sarah's right shoulder and upper arm in full view, and the scar tissue was undeniable. Extensive third-degree burns, skin twisted, and shiny patches of grafted tissue in different shades, the unmistakable mark of fire. The bar gasped collectively, horror and sympathy and shock rippling through the room. Sarah stood frozen, exposed, her worst secret laid bare for everyone to see. The leader had stumbled back, his face-stricken hands still outstretched, like he couldn't believe what he'd done. "Oh God, I didn't mean..." But Sarah wasn't running, wasn't crying. Something shifted in her face, shock transmuting into fury, into power, into a rage that had been building for 10 years, under long sleeves and careful smiles. Her voice, when she spoke, carried across the silent bar, with the force of truth finally spoken. "You think you're tough, ripping a woman's shirt in front of your friends?" Her voice rose stronger than anyone expected. "Let me tell you about tough. Let me tell you about fire." Every person in the bar leaned forward, captivated, and Sarah's words poured out like a dam breaking. October 17, 2014. I was 22 years old. I woke up to smoke alarms and flames and my mother screaming my name. I crawled to my bedroom door and the knob burned my hand. I tied bed sheets together and tried to climb out my window, and the sheets caught fire while I was hanging from them. I fell 2 stories onto rose bushes that tore me open. I got up and tried to run back inside because my baby brother was screaming for me, screaming my name, begging me to help him. Sarah's voice cracked, but she pushed through 10 years of silence ending. A neighbor tackled me, held me down while I fought, and then the gas line exploded and fire shot out the kitchen window and caught my arm and my shoulder, and I smelled my own skin cooking. The leader had tears streaming down his face, Tommy Chen beside him looking equally devastated. The bar was dead silent, even the jukebox quiet, every person present witnessing something profound. This scar, Sarah gestured to her exposed arm, no longer hiding, no longer ashamed. This is what survival looks like. This is the price of living when everyone you love dies. I've spent 10 years thinking I caused it, thinking I killed my family by leaving a hair straightener plugged in. 10 years of guilt eating me alive. 10 years hiding because I thought these scars made me ugly, made me broken, made me less than human. Her voice dropped, became steel. So no, you don't get to judge me. You don't get to make me feel weak. I survived hell and I'm still standing, and these scars prove I'm stronger than you'll ever be. Old Bill started clapping slow and steady, his weathered hands making each clap distinct and purposeful. Others joined tentative at first, then building until the entire bar erupted in applause. Daniel Brooks stood, walked over, and shrugged out of his flannel shirt, draping it over Sarah's shoulders, not covering the scar, but offering warmth, offering solidarity. You're not alone, Daniel said quietly, and his voice carried decades of his own grief, his own survival. Sheriff Ben Carter stepped forward, his face working through emotions too complicated to name. Sarah, I need to tell you something. I was there that night. Sarah turned, confusion breaking through her fury. What? I was first responder. Got there before the fire trucks. Ben's voice was rough, decades of secrets finally surfacing. I'm the one who held you down while you screamed for your family. I'm the one who kept you from running back into the flames. Recognition dawned in Sarah's eyes, memory fragments clicking into place. The voice, the strong hands. I remember you. Your father, David Thompson, was my best friend. Ben's eyes were wet now, voice breaking. We served in Vietnam together. He saved my life in Da Nang. Made me promise if anything ever happened to him, I'd watch over you. And I have Sarah. For 10 years, I've been watching over you, but there's something else, something about that fire, something I've never told anyone. The bar was so quiet, every breath was audible. Ben pulled a file from his jacket, old and worn, and handed it to Sarah with shaking hands. That fire wasn't an accident. Someone said it. I saw them running from your house that night, carrying a gas can. I never reported it because I couldn't prove who it was, and I thought telling you it was murder would destroy you. Ben's voice was barely above a whisper. Your family wasn't killed by bad wiring, Sarah. They were murdered, and I've spent 10 years investigating who did it. Sarah's knees buckled, and Daniel caught her, held her upright, while her world reoriented around this new terrible truth. Marcus Donovan, the biker who'd torn her shirt, who'd exposed her scars, was crying openly now. I failed you, Marcus said, his voice wrecked. I failed your brother. I failed your father, who was my friend. And I've spent 14 years becoming a monster because I couldn't live with what I didn't save. Tommy Chen stepped forward, his usually silent voice finding words. I was the paramedic who treated your burns. I'm the one who pronounced your brother dead. I quit emergency services 6 months later because I couldn't handle the guilt. Sarah stood surrounded by broken men carrying pieces of her tragedy, and something inside her finally broke open. Not breaking down, but breaking through 10 years of isolation, ending in the most unexpected way. Ben Carter's voice cut through the moment, hard and official again. Sarah, there's more. The man I suspected of setting the fire, Raymond Hutchins, he died in 2016. But I don't think he acted alone. I think someone else was involved, and I think they might still be watching you. The barred door opened, morning sunlight streaming in, and a stranger stood silhouetted in the doorway. Middle-aged, nondescript, carrying a toolbox. Just the building maintenance man familiar to Sarah from countless encounters, changing light bulbs and fixing leaks in her apartment. He looked at the scene-torn shirt, exposed scar crying, men-tense sheriff, and his face flickered with something dark before smoothing into false concern. Everything okay here? Sheriff Ben's hand moved to his weapon, instinct sharpening his voice. Who are you, Douglas Miller? I do maintenance around town. His eyes lingered on Sarah, on her exposed scar, with an intensity that made her skin crawl. How long you been working at Miss Mitchell's apartment building? Mr. Miller, the man's smile didn't reach his eyes. Couple years now. I like to take care of the residents. Keep them safe. Ben's face went hard, recognition or suspicion clicking into place. I think we need to talk down at the station, Mr. Miller. Some questions about where you were October 17, 2014. The maintenance man's mask dropped completely. Something cold and calculating underneath. You can't prove anything, Sheriff. And Sarah knows I've been nothing but helpful, don't you, Sarah? Sarah's voice came out strong despite the trembling. I don't know you, but I know you. The man's smile turned predatory. I've always known you, and I've kept you safe all these years, just like I promised Ray I would. Marcus and Ben moved simultaneously, but the man was already backing through the door, dropping his toolbox, running for a car parked at the curb. Ben's radio was in his hand, calling for backup, but small-town response times meant the man would be gone before anyone arrived. Sarah stood in the center of the rusty anchor, her scarred arm exposed, surrounded by people who'd carried pieces of her tragedy for years and realized her nightmare wasn't over. Someone had murdered her family. That same someone had been watching her, protecting her, keeping her trapped in a web she hadn't known existed. And now they were running, which meant the real danger was just beginning. The cruiser doors slammed in rapid succession, Pine Ridge's entire police force responding to Ben's radio. Call all 3 deputies the town's budget allowed. Douglas Miller's sedan had already disappeared around the corner, tires screeching against asphalt still damp from morning frost. But Ben was already on the phone coordinating roadblocks on the 2 highways leading out of town. Small-town law enforcement meant limited resources, but intimate knowledge of every back road and hiding spot within 30 miles. Sarah stood rooted to the floor, Daniel's flannel shirt draped across her shoulders, but doing nothing to stop the trembling that had seized her entire body. The exposed scar tissue on her arm felt raw, despite a decade of healing, as if ripping the fabric had torn open more than cloth. Around her, the bar's patrons remained frozen in their seats, witnesses to something they didn't fully understand but recognized as significant, the kind of moment that would be retold in Pine Ridge for years. Marcus Donovan hadn't moved from where he'd stumbled backward after tearing Sarah's sleeve. His face had gone gray, weathered skin pulled tight over bones that suddenly looked too prominent, and his hands shook with a tremor that spread up his arms into his massive shoulders. Tommy Chen gripped Marcus's elbow, steadying him, the silent ghost finally speaking in urgent whispers that carried across the quiet room. "You need to sit down before you collapse." Marcus shook his head, eyes locked on Sarah with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "She needs to know everything. All of it. No more secrets." Deputy Martinez, a young woman barely 30 who'd grown up 3 houses down from Sarah's current apartment, approached with her notepad already open. "Miss Mitchell, I need to get your statement about what just happened here." But Sarah's attention had narrowed to a pinpoint focus on Marcus, on this stranger who carried her brother's photograph, who claimed to have been there when Ethan died, who just revealed that the worst night of her life held layers she'd never suspected. Her voice came out steady, despite everything breaking apart inside. "You said you tried to save him? Tell me exactly what happened." Grace Murphy cleared the bar with efficient authority, her voice brooking no argument as she ushered regular customers toward the door. "We're closed for a private matter. Come back this afternoon." Old Bill Patterson refused to leave, wheeling his chair to a position near the wall where he could observe without interfering, his ancient eyes sharp and knowing. Daniel stayed too, positioning himself within arm's reach of Sarah, not touching, but present a solid anchor in the chaos. Ben finished his radio coordination and turned to find every eye in the room on him, waiting for direction, for explanation for the truth that had been buried under official lies for a decade. His voice carried the weight of 38 years carrying other people's secrets and the relief of finally setting them down. "Back room, everyone involved. That means you, Marcus Tommy. Sarah Grace Daniel can stay if Sarah wants him." He looked at his deputy. "Martinez, you too. This needs witnesses." Grace's office had barely enough space for 6 adults, the air thick with dust and old cigarette smoke, despite Montana's indoor smoking ban. Sarah took the only chair, her legs no longer reliable, while the men arranged themselves against walls and filing cabinets. Ben pulled out the file folder he'd carried for 10 years, spreading crime scene photographs across Grace's desk with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The images showed Sarah's childhood home reduced to blackened timber, yellow police tape, marking where walls had stood, where lives had ended. Sarah's breath caught, seeing it from this perspective. For the first time, she'd never looked at the investigation. Photos couldn't bear to transform memory into documented reality. But now she forced herself to study each image, searching for answers in the ashes. Ben's finger traced the burn pattern visible in one photograph, pointing to the rear of the structure. Fire started here at the back door. Accelerant used gasoline based on the burn signature. The official investigation called it electrical fault in the basement, but I knew better. He pulled out another photo, this one showing a gas can partially visible in a neighbor's trash receptacle. Found this 6 hours after the fire. No fingerprints, but the placement was deliberate. Someone wanted it found eventually, or they panicked and disposed of it poorly. "Why didn't you report it?" Sarah's voice carried no accusation, only the need to understand. Ben's jaw worked decades of self-recrimination surfacing. Because Raymond Hutchins had been released from prison 3 weeks earlier. Your father had testified against him in an arson case 5 years before warehouse fire that killed 7 people. Ray got 20 years. He'd written letters from prison, dozens of them, threatening your father, promising revenge. When I saw that gas can, I knew, but I couldn't prove it. And you, he looked at Sarah directly. You were 22, traumatized, burned, orphaned. I thought telling you someone murdered your family would destroy what was left of you, so you lied. Sarah's words fell flat, statement rather than question. I lied, and I've been investigating the truth ever since, trying to build a case that wouldn't rely on traumatizing the only survivor. Ben pulled out more documents, photocopies of prison correspondence, background checks, surveillance logs. Ray Hutchins died in 2016. Single car accident, drove off a bridge outside Seattle. Ruled accidental, but I always suspected otherwise. Either suicide from guilt or someone silencing him. Marcus pushed off the wall, his voice rough. I saw someone running that night too. Thought I was hallucinating from smoke inhalation, but they were there, moving fast from the back of the property toward the neighboring lots. Tommy nodded, speaking for the second time in years. I arrived with the ambulance, saw fresh tire tracks in the mud behind the property line. Boot prints, 2 men size 11 leading away from the house. Never mentioned it because the investigation was already calling it accidental, and I figured my observations didn't matter. Everything mattered. Ben's frustration bled through. Every detail could have built a case. But I was trying to protect Sarah, and I let a murderer walk free. Sarah's mind spun through implications, through the reality that her family's death hadn't been fate or faulty wiring, but deliberate evil. Someone had chosen to burn her house, chosen to kill her parents and brother, chosen to let her live scarred and guilt-ridden. The weight of that intention felt different from accident, heavier, somehow more personal. This Douglas Miller, she said, slowly testing the name. He said he knew Raymond, said he'd kept me safe like he promised Ray. Ben's expression hardened. Douglas Miller moved to Pine Ridge in 2016, right after Ray Hutchins died. Got a job doing maintenance work, keeps a low profile. I ran a background check when I first noticed him hanging around your building, but it came back clean. Now I'm wondering if Douglas Miller is even his real name. He pulled out his phone, fingers moving quickly across the screen, accessing databases most civilians never knew existed. Raymond Hutchins had a cellmate during his last 3 years in prison. Derek Morrison, released in 2015, disappeared from parole supervision 6 months later. Derek had been building a new identity for years, establishing credit, getting a driver's license, creating the paper trail of Douglas Miller, while still in contact with Ray. When Ray died and Derek's parole ended, he simply became Douglas full-time and moved to Pine Ridge. He'd been planning this for a year, positioning himself close to Sarah, waiting. Ben's phone buzzed before Sarah could process this newest revelation. He answered, listened, and his expression transformed into grim satisfaction. They've got him. Derek Morrison surrendered himself at the sheriff's station 20 minutes ago. Walked in unarmed, said he needed to tell Sarah the truth. The drive back to town happened in tense silence, Sarah wedged between Daniel and Marcus in Ben's cruiser. The world outside gone dark except for street lights marking Pine Ridge's minimal grid. The sheriff's station blazed with activity, unusual for a building that typically ran on a skeleton crew after 6 p.m. State police vehicles filled the lot, officers conferring in tight groups, radios crackling with coordination traffic. Derek Morrison sat in the interrogation room, visible through one-way glass, his hands cuffed to the table, his face eerily calm. He'd changed from his maintenance uniform into street clothes as if preparing for this moment. And when Ben led Sarah into the adjacent observation room, Derek's eyes tracked to the mirror like he knew exactly where she stood. Let me talk to him. Sarah's request surprised everyone, including herself. Absolutely not. Ben's refusal was immediate and absolute. He's dangerous, fixated, and we don't know his mental state. But Sarah had spent 10 years running from confrontation, hiding under long sleeves and false names, and the pretense that ignoring trauma made it disappear. Facing Derek Morrison felt necessary, somehow claiming agency in a narrative that had controlled her for too long. I need to hear it from him. Why he killed my family. Why he watched me. What he thinks gives him the right to my life. Ben looked ready to argue, then seemed to see something in Sarah's face that made him reconsider. 5 minutes, I'll be in the room with you, and we stop the moment I say stop. The interrogation room smelled like industrial cleaner, and desperation fluorescent lights humming overhead with a frequency that set Sarah's teeth on edge. Derek Morrison looked up as she entered, and his face transformed into something almost worshipful. "Sarah, you're safe. I was so worried when those bikers exposed you at the bar." His tone, like they were friends discussing a mutual concern, made Sarah's skin crawl. "You murdered my family." Derek's expression didn't change, no recognition that he'd done anything wrong. "Raymond Hutchins did that. I was just helping, keeping watch. Your biological father was a dangerous man, and Rebecca needed protection when she got pregnant. The Thompsons took you away from your real family, raised you with lies. They raised me with love." Sarah's voice stayed level through sheer force of will. "They gave me a life Rebecca wanted for me." Rebecca was weak. Derek's certainty was absolute. She gave up too easily, let outsiders take what belonged to the family. Raymond understood blood matters. He was going to bring you home after he got out of prison. But the Thompsons wouldn't give you back, wouldn't even tell you the truth. So Raymond did what was necessary. He killed 3 innocent people. He removed obstacles. Derek spoke as if explaining something obvious to a child. "The plan was always to take you after, bring you back to the family. But Raymond lost his nerve after said the fire got too big too fast. He was supposed to get you out first, but something went wrong. Then he died before we could finish the mission. So you took over, stalking me for years, working at my building, watching my son, protecting you," Derek corrected, "making sure no one else hurt you, making sure you stayed safe until you were ready to know the truth about your family. The Hutchins family, your real family. We have a responsibility to take care of our own." Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to something cold and hard. "I am a Thompson. That's my real family. And you took them from me. You watched it while Raymond burned my house. You let my brother die. You let me live with guilt for 10 years thinking I'd caused it." For the first time, something flickered in Derek's calm expression. Uncertainty, or maybe the recognition that his carefully constructed narrative didn't align with reality. "I kept you safe. I watched over you. I did what Raymond couldn't finish. You're not my protector." Sarah stood, done with this conversation, done giving this broken man any more of her time or attention. "You're a murderer and a stalker, and I'm going to watch them lock you away for the rest of your life." She walked out without looking back, leaving Derek Morrison to his delusions in the justice system Ben Carter would ensure worked properly this time. Outside, Marcus waited with Tommy, both men standing like sentinels in the parking lot. Sarah walked directly to them, making a decision she'd been forming since hearing their confessions. "You tried to save my brother." She looked at Marcus, then Tommy. "You did your and you did them right. What happened wasn't your fault. It was Raymond Hutchins' fault, and Derek Morrison's fault, and the fault of evil men making evil choices. But it was never yours." Marcus's face crumpled, 14 years of guilt finally finding permission to release. Tommy gripped his shoulder, silent as always, but present, and the 3 of them stood together in the parking lot while Pine Ridge settled into night around them. Ben emerged with documents for Sarah to sign statements, to give official processes that would unfold over months. But the immediate crisis had passed. Derek Morrison was in custody, the truth finally revealed, and Sarah stood surrounded by people who'd carried pieces of her tragedy and were now helping her transform survival into something resembling healing. But Ben's expression held something else, something Sarah recognized from years of watching people deliver bad news. "There's more, isn't there?" Ben pulled out an evidence bag containing Derek's wallet, opened it to reveal a photograph tucked behind the driver's license. A teenage girl with Sarah's eyes holding a newborn, wrapped in a hospital blanket. "Sarah, your adoption. Derek had documents about it. Rebecca Hutchins was your biological mother. Raymond was your uncle. That's why he was obsessed family, claiming you back from people he saw as kidnappers." Sarah took the photograph with hands gone numb, studying the face of a woman she'd never known, never would know. This stranger had given birth to her, then given her away to David and Margaret Thompson. The decision must have been agony, but it had also been love, the kind of love that chooses a child's safety over a mother's desire. "Does this change anything?" Daniel asked quietly, his presence steady beside her. "No." Sarah's answer came without hesitation. "It makes me understand more, but it doesn't change who my real family was. David and Margaret Thompson chose me. That matters more than blood." Ben's phone rang, another update. Another piece of the investigation clicking into place. Background on Derek Morrison just came through. He's been obsessed with you for years, Sarah. Had photos going back to when you were in high school. He and Raymond Hutchins were cellmates bonded over their shared fixation on getting you back to the Hutchins family. The violation spread through Sarah like ice water. Realizing this man had been part of her life's background for years, watching from shadows, waiting for moments she'd never know he witnessed. Every time she'd felt watched, dismissed it as paranoia, she'd been right. Her instincts had tried to warn her, but she'd learned to ignore them, learned to call survival instincts damage instead of protection. There's one more person you should know about. Ben pulled out another file. Jennifer Hutchins, Rebecca's older sister. She contested your adoption in 1992, tried to get custody. The courts ruled against her, but she's been trying to find you ever since. Lives in Missoula now, works as a nurse. Clean record. But she's family Sarah, blood family who wanted you. Sarah absorbed this information, another relative appearing from nowhere, another person with claims on her identity she'd never asked for. Do you think she's dangerous? Ben shook his head. Everything suggests she genuinely wanted to raise you, not hurt you. But after what Derek and Raymond did, I'm not taking chances. We'll approach her carefully, see what she knows. The pieces were falling into place, a puzzle Sarah hadn't known existed suddenly revealing its shape. Her adoption, her biological family's obsession, the stalking and murder, all of it connected through blood ties she'd never asked for, and choices made before she could remember. But standing in the sheriff's station parking lot with Marcus and Tommy and Daniel and Ben surrounding her, Sarah felt something shift. These men weren't her blood family, but they'd shown up, confessed their guilt, offered their help. That choice to be present, to be honest, to be vulnerable, mattered more than any genetic connection. I want to meet Jennifer, Sarah surprised herself with the words. If she's my biological aunt, if she tried to give me a home, I want to know her story. Ben nodded slowly. We'll arrange it, but on our terms in a controlled environment. Safety, Orsta. The following week blurred together, Pine Ridge settling into the rhythm of a town processing scandal. Derek Morrison's arrest made regional news, the story of a maintenance man stalking a burn survivor for years, capturing media attention Sarah hadn't wanted or anticipated. Reporters called requesting interviews. She declined them all. Her story belonged to her, not to headlines. The trial proceedings began, prosecutors building their case on Derek's journals, his obsessive documentation, his confession in the interrogation room. Sarah gave her testimony in a closed courtroom, describing years of feeling watched, the violation of learning someone had been in her home around her son, controlling her life from the shadows. Marcus and Tommy testified about the fire, their failed rescue attempts, the guilt they'd carried. Ben testified about his cover-up, his 10-year secret investigation, his determination to protect Sarah even when protection meant deception. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on all counts, conspiracy to murder, stalking, accessory to arson. Derek Morrison received life without parole, led away in handcuffs, still insisting he'd been protecting Sarah, still unable to see his actions as anything but noble. Sarah watched from the gallery as they took him away, feeling no triumph, no satisfaction. Just closure, the kind that came from seeing justice served even when justice couldn't undo damage already done. Outside the courthouse, Marcus approached with Tommy beside him. We're going back to Seattle tomorrow. Marcus's voice carried something Sarah hadn't heard before, hope. I applied to get my fire certification back. Tommy's applying for paramedic reinstatement. We're going to try again. That's good. Sarah meant it. You deserve second chances. So do you. Marcus handed her an envelope. This is from your father. I found it going through old fire department records. It's addressed to you, marked to be opened if something happened to him. Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands, David Thompson's handwriting on the front, bringing tears she'd been holding back for hours. Thank you for trying to save Ethan, for telling me the truth, for not giving up on redemption. Marcus nodded, unable to speak, and walked away with Tommy. Two old soldiers finding their way back to the work that had once saved them, hoping it would save them again. The meeting with Jennifer Hutchins happened 3 weeks later, arranged carefully by Ben, in a neutral location, a coffee shop in Missoula, with deputies present but discreet. Sarah brought Daniel for support, Dylan staying with Grace for the afternoon. She didn't know what to expect from this woman, this biological aunt, who'd wanted to raise her, whose sister had died before Sarah even knew she existed. Jennifer Hutchins looked like an older version of the girl in the photograph, same eyes, same bone structure, but aged by 50 years and loss. She stood when Sarah entered, her face cycling through emotions too complex to name. "You look like Rebecca, like my sister." They sat across from each other, coffee cooling untouched between them, and Jennifer told the story Sarah had never known. Rebecca Hutchins, pregnant at 19, fleeing an abusive boyfriend, finding refuge with a kind nurse at the hospital who introduced her to the Thompsons, a couple desperate for children Margaret couldn't have. Rebecca's decision to give up her baby, believing it was the only way to keep Sarah safe. "I tried to stop her." Jennifer's voice was rough with decades-old grief. "I was 20, working minimum wage, barely keeping myself afloat. But I wanted to raise you, wanted to keep you in the family. Rebecca wouldn't let me. She said you deserved better than poverty and chaos." And she was right. Sarah said it gently but firmly. "The Thompsons gave me a good life. They loved me." "I know." Jennifer's smile was sad. "I've been watching from a distance for years, not stalking like Derek, just checking in, making sure you were okay. When I saw you'd survived the fire, saw you rebuilding your life, I knew Rebecca had made the right choice, even though it broke my heart." They talked for 2 hours, Jennifer filling in gaps about Rebecca, a girl who loved music, who dreamed of nursing school, who died of an overdose in 2005, the pain of giving up her daughter never fully healing. Jennifer had been the one to find her body, had carried that loss along with all the others. By the end, Sarah had offered something she hadn't planned to a relationship, tentative and careful but real. "You're my aunt. That matters even if we're strangers. Maybe we can get to know each other." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "I'd like that. More than you know." 6 months dissolved the worst edges of trauma, the way winter snow melted under Montana spring sun, slowly, unevenly, leaving patches of ice in shadowed places that might never fully thaw. Sarah stood in the community center's main room, watching 12 people arrange folding chairs in a circle, their movements careful and deliberate, each person carrying invisible weight that showed in rounded shoulders and downcast eyes. Tuesday night, 7 o'clock, the Scars and Stars support group, gathering for its 15th session since Sarah and Dr. Lisa Hernandez had started this experiment in collective healing. The trial was over. Derek Morrison locked away for life. Jennifer Hutchins becoming a careful presence in Sarah's life, not replacing the family she'd lost, but adding a thread of connection Sarah hadn't known she needed. Marcus and Tommy back in Seattle sending letters about their progress. 94 lives saved between them in 6 months, redemption measured in rescues. And Sarah herself, scars visible on her arm, as she led the group through their check-ins, no longer hiding what fire had written on her skin. She was building something here, transforming her own healing into a framework others could use. It wasn't forgetting her family. It was honoring them by living the life they'd died protecting. 3 years later, Sarah Thompson Brooks stood at her nursing school graduation ceremony, Montana State University's accelerated burn trauma program, having compressed 18 months of education into 12 months of intensive study. The scholarship for survivors pursuing medical careers had made it possible. Tuition-covered books provided even a modest stipend for living expenses, while she balanced coursework with raising Dylan and working part-time at the Phoenix Bar. Grace Murphy had renamed the establishment 2 years ago. The phoenix rising from ashes painted across the new sign outside, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in Pine Ridge. This was the place where Sarah's scars had been revealed, where her community had rallied, where healing had transformed from individual struggle to collective endeavor. It felt right that it bore a name about transformation, about rising from destruction into something stronger. Dylan, now 9 years old, sat in the front row between Daniel Brooks and Ben Carter, both men having claimed roles in his life that genetics hadn't provided. Daniel had proposed 8 months ago, patient courtship, finally becoming permanent commitment, and the wedding was planned for October, 3 years, almost to the day after that morning when Marcus Donovan tore Sarah's sleeve and changed everything. Ben retired from the sheriff's department for nearly 2 years, had embraced grandfatherhood with the devotion of someone making up for lost time. He picked Dylan up from school twice a week, taught him about fingerprints and crime scene investigation, with the earnest attention of a man who had spent 40 years solving mysteries. The title Grandpa Ben had emerged naturally, Dylan bestowing it without prompting, and Ben wore it with more pride than any badge he'd ever carried. The dean called Sarah's name, and she walked across the stage in her cap and gown with her right arm bare, scars visible to the hundreds of people filling the auditorium. No more hiding, no more shame. These marks were part of her story, proof she'd survived hell and chosen to become a healer because of it, not despite it. Her clinical rotations had confirmed what her supervisors suspected. Sarah had a gift for working with trauma patients, particularly burn victims whose physical scars mirrored their psychological wounds. She could sit with a terrified child, roll up her sleeve, and watch fear transform into hope. Look at me. I survived. You will too. The supervising physician's evaluation had praised her technical skills and compassionate presence, noting that Sarah translated medical jargon into comfort with an ease that couldn't be taught. She'd found her calling in the intersection of survival and service, following her father's path toward redemption through helping others face what had nearly destroyed them. Marcus Donovan sent a letter that arrived the morning of graduation, his handwriting still carrying the careful control of hands fighting tremors. 3 years sober, 3 years back on Seattle Fire Department. 94 lives saved since returning, each one recorded in the journal he kept. Each rescue a small payment on a debt that would never fully balance. Sarah, congratulations on graduation. Your father would be so proud, his daughter becoming a nurse, helping burn victims, transforming tragedy into purpose. That's the legacy he wanted, even if he never got to see it. Tommy Chen made head paramedic at Harborview Medical Center last month. Combined, we've saved over 400 lives in 3 years. We count them because numbers matter when you're trying to prove you're more than your worst failure. I'll always carry Ethan, but now I carry him differently, not as the boy I failed to save, but as the reason I save others. That shift in perspective is everything. Thank you for teaching me scars aren't endings, they're beginnings. Marcus Sarah folded the letter and tucked it into her graduation program, another piece of healing, documented and preserved. The ceremony concluded with the traditional tossing of caps, and Sarah threw hers high into the auditorium air. Watching it spin and fall like every hope she'd thought was lost, suddenly made real again. The celebration dinner at Daniel's house, their house now, Sarah and Dylan having moved in 6 months ago, filled with people who'd become family through choice rather than accident. Grace bringing her famous lasagna, Ben grilling steaks with the concentration of someone who'd learned precision mattered. Jennifer Hutchins arriving with a cake she'd baked, still tentative after 3 years, but increasingly comfortable in this found family that had welcomed her because Sarah chose to. Old Bill Patterson, now 81 and still wheeling himself to his table at the Phoenix every morning, raised a glass of whiskey and toast. To Sarah Thompson, who survived hell and decided to help others do the same. That's heroism. That's what your father understood. They drank, and Sarah felt the weight of years lifting incrementally, not disappearing but becoming manageable. She'd never stopped missing her father, her mother, her brother, but she'd learned to carry that loss alongside joy instead of letting grief consume all available space. The wedding planning consumed the summer of Pine Ridge, mobilizing with the enthusiasm of a town that had invested emotionally in Sarah's healing and wanted to witness its culmination. Grace insisted on hosting at the Phoenix Bar because this place had meaning, history, significance that transcended simple venue selection. Daniel agreed immediately, understanding that some locations carried weight that made them irreplaceable. Sarah chose a sleeveless dress, lace, and simple elegance, her scars an integral part of her appearance rather than something to be concealed. The seamstress in Missoula had tears in her eyes during the final fitting. "You're so brave showing them like this." But Sarah had shaken her head. "It's not bravery, it's honesty. This is who I am. Why would I hide that on the most important day of my life?" Marcus and Tommy flew in from Seattle the day before the wedding, both men looking healthier than they had 3 years ago. Sobriety and purpose had filled out frames that grief and alcohol had hollowed, and their dress uniforms, Seattle Fire Department and Harborview Medical Center respectively, represented redemption earned through consistent effort over years. The rehearsal dinner happened at the Phoenix, Grace closing to regular customers for private celebration, and Sarah took the opportunity to give Marcus the gift she'd been planning for months. A shadow box frame containing Ethan's photograph, the one Marcus had carried for 17 years, mounted alongside a new photo of Marcus in his firefighter gear, and between them a plaque. "In memory of Ethan David Thompson, 2002-2014, whose dream of heroes inspired those who tried to save him, to become the heroes he always believed them to be." Marcus couldn't speak, could only hold the frame, while Tommy gripped his shoulder, and everyone else in the room understood they were witnessing something sacred. The moment when carrying guilt transformed into carrying legacy, when failure reframed as motivation, when the dead were honored by the living, refusing to quit. Thank you. Marcus's voice was wrecked when he finally found words. This means more than you know. You carried him for 17 years. Sarah's eyes were wet, but she was smiling. Now you can remember him as inspiration instead of failure. That's what he would have wanted. The wedding day arrived clear and cool October in Montana, bringing crisp promise of winter without its bite. The Phoenix Bar's parking lot had been transformed with white chairs and an archway covered in late-season roses. 50 guests filling seats while Grace officiated with online ordination obtained specifically for this purpose. Sarah walked down the makeshift aisle with Ben Carter escorting her, his hand steady on her arm, his eyes wet with emotions he'd stopped trying to hide. Your father would be so proud, he whispered. Look at what you've become. I know, Sarah whispered back, because you've told me every day for 3 years, and I'll keep telling you. Ben squeezed her hand as they reached the archway where Daniel waited. Daniel's expression when Sarah appeared made every hard thing worth it. Love without conditions, without reservation, without fear that scars diminished worth. He'd seen her at her lowest, had held space for her healing without trying to rush or fix or control it, had become father to Dylan through patient presence rather than demanding recognition, had proved through consistent action that chosen family could be as permanent and committed as biological ties. Grace's words as officiant carried the wisdom of 70 years living through loss and choosing joy anyway. These two people know grief, know loss, know what it means to survive when surviving seemed impossible. Today they choose to build something new from that survival, to create family through intention rather than accident. Marriage isn't about finding someone to complete you, it's about finding someone to witness your completeness and choose to walk beside it. Sarah's vows spoke truth without poetry, plain words carrying weight of lived experience. Daniel, you didn't fix me, I'm not broken, but you held space for me to fix myself, and that's the greatest gift. I promise to love you with all my scars and all my strength, to be partner in building life worth living, to honor the families we've lost while creating the family we're choosing. Daniel's response came rough with emotion. Sarah, you taught me it's okay to still love the ones we lost while loving the ones we find. I promise to honor our past while building our future, to be father to Dylan, husband, to you and family, to everyone we choose to include. I promise we'll face whatever comes together, because that's what family means. They exchanged rings, kissed, while guests applauded, and walked back down the aisle as married couple to bluegrass music played by local musicians who donated their time. The reception flowed into evening dancing and drinking and celebration that would be remembered as one of Pine Ridge's finest moments, not because of extravagance, but because of authenticity. Real love witnessed by real community. Old Bill gave the first toast, his voice carrying across the crowd. I'm 81 years old, survived World War II, lost my legs on Iwo Jima, spent 60 years learning that survival isn't about living through trauma, it's about living fully despite trauma. Sarah and Daniel understand that better than most. They're not just surviving, they're thriving. That's the victory. Grace cried through her speech about found family and second chances and the power of community to heal what isolation destroys. Ben talked about promises kept and daughters found and the privilege of witnessing someone transform from hiding to shining. Marcus stood, last glass raised, Seattle Fire Department uniform gleaming under string lights. To Sarah, you taught an old soldier that scars don't mean broken. They mean unbreakable. You taught me life isn't about winning battles, it's about choosing love after war. Thank you for giving me my life back by showing me how to live with mine. The applause that followed carried genuine affection. This outsider who'd once terrorized Sarah now welcomed into Pine Ridge's collective embrace, because redemption mattered more than first impressions, because transformation deserves celebration. Sarah's phone rang during the cake cutting, Marcus's name flashing on screen. She'd given him her cell number months ago, maintaining connection across distance because their shared trauma had forged bonds that geography couldn't break. She answered to find his voice tight with urgency, overlaying the sound of sirens. Sarah, I need you to know something. We just responded to a structure fire. Family of 4 trapped. Her heart stopped, phantom fear from 10 years ago, surging through her nervous system. I got them all out, Sarah. Marcus's voice cracked. All 4. A father, mother, 2 kids. The boy was in the closet just like Ethan. But this time I reached him. This time I pulled him out, and he's alive and breathing and going to be okay. I saved him, Sarah. I saved Ethan. Sarah's tears came freely, joy and grief and completion, mixing into expression, too complex for simple emotion. You saved yourself, Marcus. That's what Ethan would want. Thank you. Marcus's voice was barely audible over the sirens. Thank you for teaching me scars don't mean broken. They mean unbreakable. The call ended and Sarah returned to her wedding reception with news that felt like benediction. Marcus had saved a family, completing the circle that began in failure 17 years ago. The mission wasn't about balancing scales or earning forgiveness. It was about transformation, about damaged people choosing to become healers rather than remaining wounded. The evening ended late stars, brilliant overhead in the way they only appeared away from city lights, and Sarah stood in the parking lot turned reception space, surrounded by people who'd chosen her. Daniel beside her, Dylan asleep in Grace's office, Ben discussing something with his former deputies. Marcus and Tommy, having flown back to Seattle but present in spirit. She thought about the girl who'd hidden under long sleeves for 10 years, terrified and guilt-ridden, and convinced her scars made her unlovable. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who understood survival wasn't the end of the story but the beginning. David Thompson's voice echoed from his video message discovered 3 years ago, from his letters written for a lifetime he wouldn't witness. Live fiercely, love deeply, and know you were never alone. Sarah had lived fiercely through flames and guilt and revelation, had loved deeply despite fear and loss and trauma, and she'd learned finally permanently that she was never alone. The months following the wedding settled into rhythm. Sarah beginning her career at the Montana Burn Center while balancing marriage and motherhood with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned multitasking was survival skill. Her patient caseload included children and adults at various stages of recovery, each one carrying physical and psychological wounds that mirrored her own history. A 16-year-old girl burns covering 30% of her body from a car accident, refusing to look at herself in mirrors. Sarah sat with her during dressing changes, talking about the first time she'd worn short sleeves in public, how terrifying and liberating it had been simultaneously. You don't have to love your scars, Sarah said gently, but you have to accept them. They're part of your story now. The question is whether you let them define you or whether you define yourself despite them. The girl's progress over 6 months, from refusing visitors to slowly rejoining her high school, from hiding under hoodies to wearing tank tops at physical therapy, reminded Sarah that healing wasn't destination, but journey. That some days you move forward and some days you barely held position, but giving up was the only real failure. Dylan thrived in 4th grade, his teacher noting his unusual maturity and empathy for classmates dealing with difficulties. When Sarah asked about it, Dylan shrugged with 9-year-old nonchalance. You taught me everyone has scars. Some you can see and some you can't, but everyone's fighting something. Sarah hugged him tight, amazed by this small person who'd absorbed her hardest lessons and reflected them back with clarity she still struggled to maintain. Daniel's garage expanded, hiring 2 additional mechanics to handle growing business, and he used the extra income to establish a scholarship fund for trade school education, giving kids who couldn't afford college another path forward. When Sarah asked why, his answer was simple. Someone gave me a second chance. Seems right to pass it forward. Ben Carter's 70th birthday party filled the Phoenix bar with current and former law enforcement from across Montana, colleagues honoring 40 years of service and the integrity that defined his career, despite the 10-year secret he'd carried. The sheriff who'd replaced him gave a speech about impossible choices and the courage required to admit mistakes, and Ben stood acknowledging applause with the dignity of someone who'd finally made peace with imperfection. Jennifer Hutchins became regular presence at Sunday dinners, her relationship with Sarah deepening as they shared the interests. Both loved mystery novels, both hated spicy food, both had Rebecca's habit of humming while cooking. The connection wasn't mother-daughter, would never be, but it was real and valued, another thread in the web of chosen family that surrounded Sarah. Marcus and Tommy visited twice more that year, each visit showing continued progress. Marcus at 18 months sober, then 2 years, each milestone celebrated with the attention it deserved. Tommy speaking more, the silence that had earned him the name Ghost, gradually lifting as he found his voice through teaching paramedicine to new recruits. They bring students sometimes, Marcus explained during one visit. I tell them about Ethan, about failing to save him, about quitting and becoming something I hated. Then I tell them about saving that family 3 years ago, about the 127 rescues since then. I tell them failure doesn't define you unless you let it. The students needed to hear that Sarah thought, needed to know even heroes failed sometimes, that failure wasn't ending, but choice quit or continue, let it destroy you, or let it forge you into something stronger. The second anniversary of Sarah and Daniel's wedding approached with discussions of expansion. Maybe another child, biological or adopted, because Dylan wanted siblings, and both Sarah and Daniel understood family came in many forms. The conversation happened over coffee at the kitchen table, morning light streaming through windows while Dylan caught the school bus. I want to be honest, Sarah said carefully. I'm scared of losing people again, scared of loving someone new and having them taken away. Daniel reached across the table, taking her scarred hand in his work-roughened one. That fear makes sense, but fear can't be the reason we don't build a life. We take precautions, we love hard, and we trust that we're strong enough to survive whatever comes. Sarah nodded, knowing he was right, but feeling the weight of trauma arguing against logic. We'll think about it, not rushing, but not letting fear decide for us. The decision resolved itself unexpectedly 3 months later when Dylan came home from school with a proposition. His teacher had mentioned a foster child being placed with a family in Pine Ridge, a 7-year-old boy whose parents had died in a house fire 6 months ago. The boy was struggling nightmares and anxiety and refusing to talk about what happened. Can we meet him? Dylan asked with the earnestness of someone who recognized pain and wanted to help. Maybe I could be his friend. Maybe Mom could understand what he's going through. Sarah and Daniel exchanged glances, silent communication passing between them in the way couples developed over years of partnership. This felt significant synchronicity too pointed to ignore. The meeting happened through official channels, social workers facilitating introduction, and Sarah understood within minutes why this child had been brought to her attention. 7-year-old James carried himself with the careful stillness of someone expecting the world to hurt him, and when Sarah rolled up her sleeve showing her scars, his eyes went wide. You were in a fire too. Sarah nodded. A long time ago, it hurt really bad, and it was scary, and I missed my family for a long time after. James's walls crumbled incrementally, questions pouring out about whether the nightmare stopped, whether the guilt went away, whether you could ever feel normal again. Sarah answered with honesty that didn't sugarcoat, but didn't overwhelm, and by the end of the meeting, James had asked if maybe he could visit again. The visits became regular, then frequent, and 6 months later, Sarah and Daniel began foster parent certification process with the goal of adopting James if circumstances allowed. Dylan embraced his new brother with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been only child too long, and the house that had held grief and quiet and suddenly filled with noise and life and the chaos of children who felt safe enough to be loud. The adoption finalized 1 year later, James officially becoming James Thompson Brooks in a courthouse ceremony that felt less formal than sacred. Grace wept openly. Ben gripped Sarah's shoulder with pride, so palpable it needed no words. Jennifer brought a photo album. She'd compiled pictures of Rebecca, of Sarah as a baby, of family James would never meet, but whose love had led to his current safety. You saved him, Marcus said during a video call that night, both he and Tommy on screen from Seattle. Sarah, you took your worst trauma and turned it into someone else's salvation. That's what heroes do. But Sarah shook her head. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who survived and decided surviving wasn't enough. Living means helping others survive too. The years continued their forward march. Dylan had graduating middle school, then starting high school. James healing slowly from his own fire trauma with Sarah's patient guidance and professional therapy. The Scars and Stars support group expanded to 40 regular members, meeting twice weekly, becoming model for similar programs across Montana. Sarah's reputation as burn trauma specialist grew hospitals across the state, requesting her consultation on difficult cases, patients specifically asking for the nurse who understood, because she'd survived it herself. She never forgot where she'd started, the girl, hiding under long sleeves, believing her scars made her broken. That girl's pain informed every interaction with patients who saw themselves as permanently damaged. You're not broken, she'd tell them, again and again. You are healing. There's a difference. Marcus's letters continued arriving, now documenting 5 years sober, 217 lives, saved, a promotion to battalion chief overseeing multiple stations. Tommy made director of paramedicine education for Washington State, training hundreds of new EMTs and paramedics each year. Both men had transformed from broken veterans into leaders who understood trauma didn't disqualify you from heroism. Sometimes it qualified you better than those who'd never faced darkness. Ben Carter's 75th birthday celebration brought together 5 generations of Pine Ridge law enforcement, current officers honoring the legacy of integrity and service he'd established. He was older now, moving slower, but his mind remained sharp and his commitment to community undiminished. He still picked up Dylan and James from school once a week, still taught them about investigation and justice, and keeping promises even when promises got complicated. Grace Murphy announced her retirement at 85, selling the Phoenix Bar to a young couple who promised to maintain its spirit as community gathering place. Her farewell party lasted 3 days, half of Montana, showing up to honor the woman who'd kept the bar alive for 60 years while grieving a husband who never came home. She moved into a smaller house near Sarah and Daniel, close enough to be daily presence in her grandchildren's lives, because that's what Grace had become through choice and love and years of showing up. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, 10 years almost to the day after Marcus had torn Sarah's sleeve and changed everything. Seattle Fire Department chaplain voice, professional but carrying weight, asking if Sarah was sitting down before delivering news she'd known would come eventually, but hoped would wait longer. Marcus Donovan had died responding to a warehouse fire, saving 3 people before the building collapsed. He'd known the risk, radioed that the structure was unstable, went in anyway because that's what firefighters did. The falling debris had killed him instantly. No suffering, and the 3 people he'd saved included a 12-year-old boy hiding in a closet. Sarah's grief hit with unexpected force. This man who'd been stranger than confessor, then friend, suddenly gone. She flew to Seattle for the funeral, Daniel and the boys beside her joining thousands of firefighters from across the country honoring one of their own. Tommy Chen gave the eulogy, his voice steady despite tears. Marcus Donovan spent 44 years as a firefighter, saved 231 lives in that time, quit for 12 years after failing to save 1, then came back and saved 64 more in his final 5 years. He died doing what he loved, running toward danger to protect the innocent. That's not tragedy, that's legacy. The funeral procession stretched for miles, fire trucks from dozens of departments, and when they passed under the arch of ladder trucks with American flags suspended between them, Sarah thought about Ethan, thought about the boy Marcus had failed to save, the guilt that had driven him into darkness, the redemption he'd found through refusing to quit. Marcus had saved Ethan in the end, not the physical boy who died in 2014, but every child who lived because Marcus chose to return to firefighting despite his fear. Legacy wasn't about one moment of failure or success. It was about the cumulative weight of choices made over decades of showing up. At the reception following the burial, the family of the last people Marcus saved approached Sarah. The father's eyes were red, his voice thick. The chaplain said, "You knew Marcus." Said he'd been carrying guilt from another fire for years. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "He saved my son," the father continued. Tommy, 12 years old, hiding in a closet just like the chaplain said Marcus's friend's son did years ago. Marcus got Tommy out seconds before the roof collapsed. "He gave us back our boy." The man's wife pulled out her phone showing a photo of a grinning 12-year-old holding a toy fire truck. "We took this at the hospital after Marcus visited. Tommy asked if he could be a firefighter when he grew up. Marcus gave him this truck and said if Tommy wanted to save people someday, he'd be honored to have helped make that happen." Sarah's tears fell freely, grief and pride and completion mixing into something almost like peace. Marcus had saved Ethan, not the original Ethan, but the next one and the one after that, and 63 more. The boy who died had become the reason dozens of other boys lived. That was legacy. That was transformation. That was everything her father had tried to teach her about turning tragedy into purpose. The final scene of Sarah's story happened 5 years after Marcus's death, 15 years after that October morning when everything changed. She stood in the Pine Ridge Community Center at a ceremony honoring the Scars and Stars support group's 15th anniversary, 200 people filling the room. Current members, former members, family and friends, and community leaders. The program had expanded beyond anything Sarah had imagined, now operating in 30 Montana towns, with professional counselors and peer support specialists trained in trauma-informed care. Funding came from state grants and private donations and a foundation established by Marcus Donovan's estate. The man who'd carried guilt for years had left his savings to help others heal from trauma. Sarah, now 47, took the podium with grace earned through decades of transformation. Her hair held threads of gray. Her face showed lines of age and laughter, and her right arm bore scars that had faded to pale ivory, but remained visible testimony to survival. 15 years ago, she began. A man named Marcus Donovan tore my sleeve in this town's bar and exposed scars I'd been hiding for 10 years. In that moment, I had two choices: retreat further into hiding or finally face what fire had written on my skin. She paused, looking out at faces both familiar and new. I chose to face it, not because I was brave, because I was tired. Tired of hiding, tired of shame, tired of letting trauma control every aspect of my life. And what I discovered is that healing isn't something you do alone. It's something you do in community with people who understand because they've survived their own fires. Literal fires or metaphorical ones, doesn't matter. Pain is pain. Survival is survival. And healing is the choice we make every day to keep going. Marcus Donovan died saving a 12-year-old boy from a fire. The boy's name was Tommy, just like Marcus's friend, who'd been a paramedic and later directed Washington State's EMS education programs until his retirement 3 years ago. Tommy Chen is here today, and he asked to say something. Tommy, now 63 and moving slower but still carrying himself with quiet dignity, stepped to the podium. Marcus Donovan was my friend for 43 years. Saved my life multiple times, once literally in Vietnam, many times figuratively when I wanted to give up after the Thompson family fire. He looked directly at Sarah. You saved his life too, Sarah. You gave him permission to forgive himself, to return to the work he loved, to die doing what mattered most. That's not a small thing. That's everything. The applause built slowly, then crescendoed, recognition spreading through the room that they were witnessing something profound. Ben Carter stood leaning heavily on his cane at 80, joining the ovation. Grace Murphy, 90 years old and still sharp, wiped tears from her eyes. Dylan, now 24 and in his final year of medical school, applauded beside his husband. James, 22 and working as a trauma counselor, stood with his fiancée. Sarah's family, biological adoptive chosen, built through intention and love, filled the front rows, proof that loss didn't mean ending, that families could be rebuilt through choice as powerful as blood. The ceremony concluded with a memorial to everyone lost to fire, everyone saved from fire, everyone who transformed trauma into purpose. Candles lit one by one until the community center glowed, each flame representing a life touched by this work Sarah had started because Marcus Donovan had exposed her scars and forced her to confront what she'd been hiding. That night, back at home with Daniel, their children grown and launched, but visiting for the anniversary, Sarah stood on their porch looking at Montana stars. The same stars Ethan had wanted to explore, the same sky that had watched her burn and survive and rebuild. Daniel joined her, his arms circling her waist with the comfort of 20 years together. What are you thinking? That I'm grateful. Sarah leaned into his warmth. For the fire that tried to kill me but made me stronger. For Marcus, who exposed my scars and taught me hiding wasn't protecting. For you and Ben and Grace and everyone who chose to be my family when genetics failed me. For this life I built from ashes. Daniel kissed her temple and they stood together, watching the stars, proof that even light born from burning eventually reached earth and illuminated darkness. Sarah Thompson Brooks, survivor of fire, creator of community healing programs, mother and wife and nurse and advocate, had spent 15 years proving that scars weren't marks of damage, but badges of survival. That the strongest people were often those carrying visible wounds they'd chosen to display rather than hide. That love was always a choice and family was always something you built, rather than something you were merely born into. Somewhere overhead, the stars burned the way they'd burned for millions of years, constant and reliable, and proof that fire could create light instead of only destruction. Somewhere in Seattle, Tommy Chen was training the next generation of paramedics, teaching them that failure was part of the job, but quitting was optional. Somewhere in Pine Ridge, 200 people who'd attended the anniversary ceremony were returning to their homes carrying the knowledge that they weren't alone in their pain, that healing was possible, that community mattered more than anything. And here on this porch, Sarah stood with her husband, watching stars and remembering everyone who'd died so she could live, Everyone who'd lived to help her heal, everyone who'd proven that transformation was always possible if you chose it daily and worked for it constantly and loved hard enough to risk being hurt again. The fire had tried to destroy her family. Instead, it had forged her into someone who could help others survive their own flames. And that transformation from victim to survivor to healer to advocate was the greatest tribute she could give to David and Margaret and Ethan Thompson, the family who'd chosen her first and loved her last and never lived to see what she'd become. But they would be proud. Of that, Sarah was absolutely certain, because she was living fiercely, loving deeply, and proving every single day that she was never, ever alone.